My name is Emily Carter. I'm 28, and I never thought my own parents would put a price tag on me. On Christmas night, in our Portland home, glowing with lights and laughter, they looked me in the eye and said I was no longer family. My brother smirked. My father turned away, and my mother's voice cut deeper than the winter cold. The reason: $150,000. In that single moment, I realized I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was just the sacrifice they were willing to make. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The front yard sparkled with white lights draped over the porch, and through the big bay window I could see the tall pine tree my mother had insisted on buying. At least 10 feet high, decorated with glass ornaments that had been in our family for decades. Inside the dining room table, stretched under a crimson cloth, polished silverware lined neatly, and tall candles flickered in their holders. The smell of roasted ham and cinnamon rolls filled the air, yet none of it made me feel at home. I sat at the far end of the table, my plate untouched, my fingers tracing the rim of my glass. Around me the conversation was lively, but I could feel the way their eyes slid past me, the subtle pauses when I tried to join in. My chest tightened as I realized I was simply filling a chair like a guest who had wandered into the wrong house. Margaret. My mother raised her glass. Her lipstick was flawless, her pearl necklace catching the light as she smiled across the table at Daniel, my older brother. "To another successful year for Carter Events," she declared. Everyone clinked glasses except me. My father Thomas nodded along his eyes, fixed on the tablecloth as if it held some secret answer. I whispered, "Congratulations," but my voice was drowned out by Daniel's laughter. He leaned back in his chair, arms wide as though he were the reason for the season. "Another record-breaking year, Mom. You really are the queen of Portland weddings." She beamed at him, pride glowing on her face. Then her gaze shifted to me and the warmth vanished. Her smile hardened, her voice cutting through the room. "And you, Emily, still chasing that fantasy, still wasting your time on those little scripts." The laughter died. Forks paused midair. Heat rushed to my cheeks. "I'm still writing," I said quietly. "It's what I love." Daniel smirked, swirling his wine glass. "So no invitations from Hollywood this Christmas." What a shock. My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. "I'm working with smaller studios trying to build something real." My father finally spoke barely above a whisper. "Margaret." He didn't finish the sentence, just cleared his throat and looked away, eyes on his glass as always. My mother leaned forward, elbows on the table, her eyes sharp as blades. "You've embarrassed us long enough. Do you understand how it looks while your brother is carrying the company you're off playing at being a writer?" The room grew heavy. I tried to steady my breathing, but my pulse pounded in my ears. "I'm not playing," I said. "I've worked hard. Just because it's not your path doesn't mean it's worthless." Her chair scraped against the hardwood as she stood. The sound sliced through me. "You've failed. And there is no place in this family for failure." I froze. For a second I thought I'd misheard her, but her face was stone, her words ringing in my head. Daniel laughed softly, shaking his head. "Guess Santa's not the only one crossing names off the list tonight." "Mom, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. She pointed at the door. "Get out, Emily." "Oh, you are not part of this family anymore." My chair toppled backward as I stood. The room blurred through my tears, but I saw them clearly enough. My brother's smirk, my father's silence, my mother's unwavering glare. My legs trembled as I stumbled toward the hallway, my coat barely hanging on my arm. "Don't come back," she added, her voice echoing after me. The front door slammed behind me with a force that seemed to close off my entire life. I stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting into my skin, snowflakes stinging my cheeks. For a moment I stood there frozen, staring through the window at the glow inside. They had already returned to their meal, laughter rising again as though nothing had happened. I walked down the icy steps, my boots crunching in the snow, my breath forming clouds in the night. On the street, the neighborhood was alive with holiday cheer, houses strung with lights, carols drifting faintly from a neighbor's radio. It all felt like another universe, one I no longer belonged to. I stopped at the end of the driveway, turning back one last time. The Carter house shone bright, the tall tree glittering behind the glass, the candles casting warm halos across the table where I had sat just minutes earlier. But the warmth was gone. I was out here alone, shivering under the weight of my mother's words. My voice in the silence cracked as I whispered to myself, "Merry Christmas." I pulled my coat tighter around me, snow crunching underfoot as I walked away from the house that had just closed its doors on me forever. When I think back to how it all began, my childhood feels like a series of rehearsals for events I never wanted to attend. Our house in Portland doubled as headquarters for Carter events, and every weekend it seemed like the living room turned into a war room. Clipboards, flower samples, and fabric swatches took over the dining table, while phones rang with frantic brides or demanding corporate clients. I was always there, but never really part of it. Just a pair of small hands assigned to carry folding chairs or polish glasses. Daniel, on the other hand, was treated like a prince in training. By the time he was 10, my mother Margaret had him shadowing her at venues, introducing him to clients as if he were already her partner. Daniel has a natural sense for presentation. She would gush her hand on his shoulder, pride glowing in her eyes. He soaked it up like sunlight, grinning as though he'd already inherited the empire. Me, I was told to stay out of the way. If I touched the linens, Margaret's voice would slice through the room. "Don't wrinkle those, Emily. You'll ruin everything." If I carried flowers, Daniel would smirk. "Try not to drop them." Every task felt like a test I was destined to fail. But there was one place where I felt seen: my grandmother Florence's porch. She lived across town in a modest little house with ivy climbing the walls. I'd sit with her after school, the smell of her lavender lotion lingering in the air as we cracked open old movie scripts she kept from her years as a literature teacher. She had a way of leaning close, her wrinkled finger underlining dialogue, whispering, "Do you see how powerful this line is? You could write like this." When I turned 11, she gave me her old typewriter, a heavy black machine with worn keys. "This is yours now," she told me, smiling. "With this, you can build worlds no one can take from you." I remember carrying it home like treasure, my heart beating fast. That night, I sat at my desk in the corner of my bedroom, hammering out my first clumsy story about a girl who escaped her family by running away to the circus. The keys stuck, the ribbon smudged, but to me it was magic. The contrast between my two worlds grew sharper as I got older. On one side of the house, Carter events bustled, my mother barking orders, Daniel taking notes, clients dropping by to sip coffee and talk budgets. On the other side, behind my closed door, I hunched over the typewriter, creating lives where daughters weren't measured against balance sheets. Sometimes I could hear the echoes of laughter from the kitchen while I tapped away inventing dialogue for characters who got the last word. One afternoon when I was 12, I made the mistake of leaving a draft on the kitchen counter. I had been working for weeks on a story about a girl who dreamed of being a playwright. It was messy, full of cliches, but it was mine. When I came back from school, I found my mother holding the pages. Her lips were pressed into a hard line. "What is this?" she demanded, waving the papers in the air. I swallowed, my palms sweaty. "It's a story I wrote. Just something for fun." Her laugh was sharp, almost cruel. "Fun. Emily, this won't put food on the table. This won't keep a roof over your head. Do you think scripts will pay the mortgage?" I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. Before I could grab the pages, she tore them in half, then into smaller shreds, letting the pieces fall into the trash can. "This is nonsense. You need to stop wasting your time and learn something useful. Daniel already understands what it takes. Why can't you—" I stood frozen, the sound of ripping paper still ringing in my ears. Daniel leaned against the doorway, smirking, his arms folded across his chest. Told you, he said casually, as though the destruction of my dreams was nothing more than a joke. That night, I locked myself in my room, the typewriter silent on my desk. I pulled the blanket over my head and cried until my eyes burned. It felt like more than just torn pages. It was a piece of me shredded and thrown away. My mother's words seared into me. "This won't keep a roof over your head." From that moment on, I carried her sentence like a scar I couldn't hide. Still, even as I lay awake in the dark, I whispered to myself the stories I wanted to tell. Somewhere deep down, I knew I couldn't let her voice be the only one I heard. Florence's belief in me echoed louder, reminding me that one day, somehow, I'd prove I was more than just a failure at the family table. And yet, as the years stretched on, that scar only deepened. In 2023, I thought things were finally turning around. I had landed a position as a production assistant with the Portland Film Collective. It wasn't glamorous, mostly fetching coffee, carrying cables, running errands across town. But it was a foot in the door. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere that wasn't Carter Events. I remember the first day on set, the smell of sawdust and fresh paint from the makeshift stage, the buzz of people who actually cared about stories. I stayed late even when my shift was over, just to watch the director explain blocking to the actors. I scribbled notes in the margins of my notebook ideas for my own scripts. For a brief moment, I believed maybe my mother was wrong. Maybe stories could keep a roof over my head. That illusion didn't last. By midsummer, the budget collapsed. Investors pulled out. One morning, we arrived at the studio and found the doors, locked equipment, half-packed. The producer gathered us in the parking lot, his voice heavy. "I'm sorry, folks. We're done. There's no money left." Just like that, the project was dead. I stood there, clutching my worn backpack, watching everyone scatter, some crying, others already calling contacts for the next gig. I felt like the ground had given way beneath me. The paycheck I counted on evaporated, and with it my rent. Within a month, I was behind on bills, eating ramen out of a pot because I couldn't afford plates of takeout anymore. My landlord slipped a final notice under the door. Packing up that tiny studio apartment was one of the hardest things I'd done. I only had 3 cardboard boxes, one for my books, one for clothes, and one for my laptop and typewriter. I left behind the sagging couch I'd bought secondhand, the chipped coffee table. Standing in the empty room, I pressed my forehead against the wall, ashamed of how quickly I'd fallen back to zero. I called my father not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. My voice shook as I asked if I could move back in for a while. He paused, then muttered, "Talk to your mother." When Margaret answered, her tone was brisk, almost triumphant. "I knew this would happen. Bring your things, and maybe this time you'll realize where you really belong." Driving back to the Carter house felt like a slow march toward defeat. The neighborhood looked the same. Well-kept lawns, wreaths on doors, neighbors waving. But it felt different to me, like I was returning in chains. Margaret met me at the door. She folded her arms, looking me over as though confirming her prediction had come true. "See, the company has always been your real home. You should have stopped playing make-believe a long time ago." I wanted to tell her that stories weren't make-believe, that they mattered. Instead, I carried my boxes past her into my old room. The posters from high school were gone, replaced by storage bins of event supplies. It wasn't my room anymore. It was overflow storage for Carter Events. I set my boxes down in the corner, feeling like a guest in a house that had once been mine. That first dinner back was unbearable. Margaret talked nonstop about new contracts, Daniel chimed in about clients he had charmed, and my father nodded, his eyes glued to his plate. I sat quietly, pushing green beans around with my fork. Margaret finally turned to me. "Now that you're back, you'll help with the business. It's time you pulled your weight." Daniel grinned. "Maybe she can be the comic relief. A little entertainment for the clients. I mean, if she can't make a real film, at least she can make them laugh." Laughter erupted from him, but it wasn't funny. My mother smirked. My father stayed silent. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms. Every meal became the same. A tribunal where my failures were recited, My worth measured against Daniel's supposed success. Sometimes I escaped to my room after dinner, opening my laptop in the dim light, typing quietly while the muffled sounds of business calls echoed down the hall. But the walls felt thinner than ever, and the weight of their voices pressed into me. It wasn't just a house anymore, it was a cage, each meal another reminder that I had lost, and they had won. Still, somewhere inside, a part of me refused to die. I looked at my typewriter in the corner, the gift from Florence, and promised myself I would keep going even if no one believed I could. But in that moment, surrounded by their scorn, all I could feel was the crushing reality of being back under their roof, trapped in a life I had tried so hard to escape. The cold cut straight through my coat as I stood on the porch, snow catching in my hair, my knuckles red from pounding on the door. I called out for my mother, for my father, even for Daniel, but no one came. Behind the curtains, I saw shadows moving, the flicker of the Christmas tree lights, the faint rise of laughter drifting into the night. They heard me. They just didn't care. I wrapped my arms around myself and stepped off the porch. My boots sank into the fresh snow, the crunch loud in the silence of the neighborhood. Every house on the block glowed with warmth. Wreaths on doors, children's voices carrying from inside, carols playing faintly from a radio next door. It was like the entire world was celebrating while I was exiled into the cold. I walked aimlessly for a while, my breath puffing out in quick clouds, until the neon vacancy sign of a roadside motel came into view. The place looked tired, its paint peeling, and the lobby lit by a single buzzing fluorescent bulb. I stepped inside, stamping snow from my boots. The clerk barely looked up, sliding a key across the counter after swiping my debit card. My hand trembled as I signed the receipt, the last bit of pride slipping away with every stroke of the pen. The room smelled faintly of bleach and cigarette smoke. The carpet was thin, the bed sagged, and the heater rattled like it might give out at any second. I sat on the edge of the mattress, pulling my phone from my pocket. I needed to know where I stood, what I had left. Opening my banking app, my stomach dropped. The emergency account balance blinked 0. I scrolled through the transaction history, my pulse quickening. A withdrawal for $2,000 had been made just the day before. The name attached to it was unmistakable, Daniel Carter. A sharp cry escaped my throat, half anger, half heartbreak. It wasn't enough for him to mock me at every turn. He had stolen from me too. That money was supposed to be my safety net, my lifeline. I pressed his number, holding the phone to my ear. The call went straight to voicemail. My voice shook as I spoke. "Daniel, it's me. I saw the account. You took it. All of it. $2,000 gone. Do you have any idea what you've done? That was all I had left. You've always wanted me to fail, and now you've made sure of it." My throat tightened, words sticking. I hope it was worth it. I hung up my hand, trembling. For a long moment, I just sat there in the dim room, staring at the faded wallpaper, listening to the heater groan. My chest ached with the weight of it all. No home, no family, no money. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I curled onto the bed, pulling the thin blanket over myself. The night stretched endlessly. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face, her finger pointing at the door, her words slicing through me. I saw Daniel's smirk, as if he were proud to have pushed me this far. My father's silence hurt most of all. He could have stopped it. He didn't even try. I reached into my bag and pulled out the typewriter ribbon box I still carried, the last reminder of Florence. I held it in my hand like a talisman, the weight of her belief in me pressing against my palm. "What do I do now, Grandma?" I whispered into the dark. The hum of the heater filled the silence. My phone lay face up on the nightstand, the empty bank balance still glowing on the screen. For the first time in my life, I felt like there was nothing left to fall back on. I closed my eyes, the sound of wind against the window mixing with the faint rattle of the pipes. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this was the bottom. There was nowhere else to go but up. But lying there in that motel room with snow piling outside and my family celebrating without me, it was hard to believe anything good could come next. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, the neon light from the sign outside flickering through the curtains, and waited for morning. A week later, as I sat hunched over the rickety desk in the motel room, my phone buzzed with a new email. The subject line froze me in place: Florence Hayes Trust. My grandmother's name glowed on the screen like a beacon from another life. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. She had been gone for 2 years and no one in my family spoke her name anymore. My hands trembled as I opened the message. It was from a lawyer named Robert Mills. He introduced himself formally, explaining that he had been the attorney responsible for managing a trust set up by Florence Hayes before her death. He wrote that there were urgent matters concerning my rights under that trust, and he requested that I contact him immediately to arrange a meeting. I stared at the words until they blurred. My grandmother had thought of me. Not only thought of me. She had planned for me, left something behind when no one else believed I was worth anything. My throat tightened. For the first time since that night on the porch, I felt something other than despair. The following afternoon, I walked into a downtown Portland office building, clutching the strap of my bag like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. I checked in with the receptionist, who gave me a polite smile and led me to a small conference room. Robert Mills was already there, a man in his mid-40s with kind but steady eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stood to shake my hand. "Ms. Carter," he said warmly. "Thank you for coming." My voice cracked as I answered. I didn't know my grandmother left anything like this." He nodded, sliding a thick envelope across the table. "Florence Hayes cared for you deeply. She anticipated that there might be conflicts within your family. This trust was her way of protecting your future." I stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it, as if it might vanish if I did. Robert gestured encouragingly. "Go ahead. There's also a personal letter she wanted you to read." With shaking hands, I tore the flap open and pulled out a stack of legal documents, heavy with seals and signatures, and a smaller envelope with my name written in her delicate cursive. My breath caught. I hadn't seen her handwriting in years, but it was instantly familiar, like hearing a voice from a dream. I opened the letter carefully, smoothing the paper as if it were fragile glass. Her words spilled across the page, steady and purposeful. "My dearest Emily, I know you have always walked a harder path in this family. I saw the way your mother dismissed your dreams, the way your father stayed silent, the way Daniel took more than he ever gave. I want you to know that I always believed in you. Your stories matter. Your voice matters. That is why I created this trust for you. The house is yours to claim, and the funds are for your writing. If they choose money over you, remember that money belongs to you. Do not let them take it away." Tears blurred my vision, dropping onto the paper. I pressed the letter to my chest as if holding it close could somehow bring her back. Robert gave me a moment, then spoke gently. "Florence left you more than sentiment. The trust includes a property, an apartment in Portland, and a financial account intended specifically to support your career. It was structured to ensure you had independence free from interference by the rest of the family." I wiped my eyes. Why didn't anyone tell me this? His expression hardened slightly. "Your parents were notified at the time of her passing, but they never shared the information with you. In fact, I've recently discovered some discrepancies in how the trust has been managed. We'll need to address those soon." The words hit me like a warning bell, but in that moment all I could cling to was the fact that my grandmother had believed in me so fiercely that she had built a safety net expecting the storm I was now living through. I leaned back in the chair, the weight of the letter in my hands, and for the first time since Christmas night, I felt something stir inside me that wasn't shame or anger. It was resolve. I looked up at Robert, my voice steadier now. "I want to know everything, every detail. I need to understand exactly what my grandmother left me and what they tried to hide." He nodded. "Then we'll start with the trust documents. But Emily, I have to warn you. This may get complicated. Your family will likely fight it." "I don't care," I said, clutching the letter again. They've already taken everything else. I won't let them take this too. Robert gathered the documents into neat piles, preparing to walk me through them, but I hardly heard him. My grandmother's words still echoed in my mind, fierce and unwavering. If they choose money over you, remember that money belongs to you. In that quiet conference room with the city humming outside the window, I felt the first flicker of strength I'd thought I had lost forever. Robert slid another stack of papers across the table, the weight of them heavy even before I touched them. His voice was calm, deliberate, but every word landed like a stone. Emily. Part of the trust's assets were misused. A withdrawal of $150,000 was made last year, supposedly for business purposes. I blinked at him, sure I had misheard. $150,000. My throat tightened around the number. That money was supposed to be for me. For my writing, for my future. He nodded gravely. I know. And here is where it gets difficult. He opened the folder, pulling out copies of bank records and authorization forms. These withdrawals were signed by your father, Thomas Carter, and your brother, Daniel. According to the correspondence, your mother directed the transactions. I stared at the page, the black ink of their signatures glaring up at me. My father's handwriting, familiar from birthday cards and school forms, stamped on a line beneath the figure $150,000. Daniel's looping scrawl right beside it. The paper might as well have been a knife. I pushed the folder back, my hands shaking. They didn't just shut me out of the family. They stole from me. From Florence. My voice rose raw and sharp. They knew it was mine. They knew she meant it for me. Robert folded his hands. Yes. It's a serious breach of trust law. They used those funds to support Carter events covering expenses for venue upgrades and marketing campaigns. We can prove it. The air felt thin around me. The memory of Christmas night burned hot. My mother's cold words, the door slamming the snow in my hair. And now this. Being cast out was one kind of pain, but discovering that my own blood had siphoned away my inheritance, the one safety net Florence had built for me, was something else entirely. It was betrayal at the deepest level. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, trying to steady my breath. I thought I'd already hit bottom, I whispered. Turns out they were still digging the hole deeper. Robert leaned forward, his tone firmer now. You need to decide how you want to move forward. This will not be an easy battle, Emily. Your family will not surrender quietly. I lowered my hands and looked back at Florence's letter resting on the table beside the documents. Her words swam in my mind. If they choose money over you, remember that money belongs to you. She had seen this coming. She had known them better than I ever wanted to. Something inside me shifted then. The grief that had been pressing me down hardened into resolve. I sat up straighter, my voice steadier than I felt. If they want a war over money, they'll get one. I won't let them erase me again. Robert gave a single approving nod. Then we'll prepare. I'll begin the formal notice to challenge their use of the trust funds. I picked up the letter with both hands, the paper soft and worn, and held it to my chest. It was more than ink on a page. It was a vow. Florence hadn't just left me money. She had left me a weapon, a chance to fight back. I looked down at my father's signature one last time, the image searing itself into my memory. They thought I'd stay silent, I said quietly, almost to myself. They thought wrong. The conference room fell silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock. Outside, the city moved on, cars passing on wet pavement, people carrying on with their ordinary lives. But for me, everything had changed. In that moment, I wasn't just the daughter who had been cast aside. I was the rightful heir to Florence's legacy. I closed the folder and slid it back toward Robert. My hands no longer shook. Tell me what we need to do next. He met my gaze steadily. First we gather evidence, then we confront them. I nodded, the letter still clutched tightly in my grip. For the first time since that freezing night in December, I felt stronger than the doubts that had haunted me. Florence's voice was with me, urging me forward, reminding me that this fight was mine to win. The conference room was too small for the storm that filled it. A long oak table stretched between us, polished to a shine that reflected the stack of documents Robert Mills had placed at the center. I sat on one side, Florence's letter folded neatly in front of me like a shield. Across from me sat my mother, Margaret, dressed in her usual tailored blazer, lips pressed tight. My father, Thomas, avoided my eyes, his hands, folded knuckles white. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug grin tugging at his mouth. Robert cleared his throat, his voice steady. "We're here to address the Florence Hayes Trust. As you all know, the trust was established specifically for Emily to provide her with housing and financial support for her career. The withdrawal of $150,000 for Carter events constitutes a violation of the trust's terms." Margaret's eyes narrowed and her voice cut through the room like glass. "Violation. That money went to keep our company alive. The company that puts food on the table. Emily hasn't lifted a finger for it. She doesn't deserve a dime." Heat rushed into my face, but I kept my tone even. If it was really about the company, why throw me into the snow on Christmas night? Why tell me I wasn't family anymore? Don't pretend this was about survival. It was about control. Daniel laughed under his breath, then leaned forward. "You think you're entitled to all this? You've done nothing. You've never closed a deal, never managed a client. You sit around scribbling stories no one wants to read while Mom and I build something real." Robert raised a hand, his voice firmer now. "This isn't about whether Emily worked at the company. The trust was Florence's decision, and her wishes are legally binding. Misusing the funds is grounds for restitution." My father shifted uncomfortably, still not meeting my gaze. Margaret shot him a look sharp enough to silence him. She turned back to me. "Your grandmother always spoiled you. She thought you were special, but she was wrong. You don't have what it takes. This business is the family's future, and you're nothing but a liability." My chest tightened, the words hitting old scars. But this time I didn't shrink. I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "I may not have what you wanted, but I have what Grandma saw in me. She believed in me when none of you did. She gave me this trust because she knew you'd try to take everything. And she was right." Daniel slammed his fist on the table, the sound making me flinch despite myself. "You're pathetic, a parasite. You've lived under this roof, eating our food, using our money, and now you want to play the victim." The room shook with his rage. Robert stayed calm, sliding the documents closer to them. "The records don't lie. These withdrawals were unauthorized. Emily has the right to demand repayment as well as ownership of the property designated to her." Margaret's face flushed red, but her voice came out icy. "You can't rewrite history with paperwork. We built Carter events from nothing. Daniel is the one who carries this family. He's the heir, not her." I felt something break free inside me then, a line drawn sharp in the sand. My voice rose steady and fierce. "I'm not your heir, and I never wanted to be. But I am your daughter, and you made it clear what that means to you when you chose money over me. You disowned me that night. You made me a stranger." For the first time, my father lifted his head. His mouth opened as if he wanted to speak, but nothing came out. He closed it again, staring down at the table, his silence louder than Daniel's shouts. I placed Florence's letter on the table, sliding it forward so they could see her handwriting. "She knew you would do this. She warned me. And she made sure I had the strength to fight you." The room went still. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Margaret's jaw clenched. Daniel's hands shook where they gripped the table. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the failure they'd painted me to be. I felt like someone standing on her own side of the line, no longer begging to be included. Robert broke the silence, his voice measured but firm. "This isn't just a family dispute anymore. This is a legal matter, and I assure you we will pursue it fully." I sat back in my chair, my heart still pounding, my palms damp, but my spine straight. Whatever came next, the line between us was clear. I wasn't their puppet, their scapegoat, or their liability. I was something else entirely now. Someone they couldn't control. The article broke on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in the corner booth of a coffee shop downtown, nursing a cup I couldn't afford, when my phone lit up with the headline, "Carter Events Under Scrutiny for Misuse of Family Trust." The author was Janet Miller, a local investigative reporter whose byline I had seen plenty of times before. She had a reputation for exposing corruption in small-town businesses that thought no one was watching. I scrolled through the piece, my stomach tightening with each line. She had details. Names, numbers, dates. She cited documents that matched the very ones Robert had shown me. She didn't hold back either, describing how a family trust meant for the artistic pursuits of one member had been drained to prop up a struggling event company. Reading it felt like watching my private humiliation laid bare for the world, but instead of shame, something else bubbled up. Relief, validation. Someone else had finally said it out loud. By noon, my phone was buzzing with calls and texts, most of them numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored them all, slipping the phone back into my bag. I didn't need to hear strangers' pity or gossip. I just wanted to breathe. Later that day, Robert called. His voice was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of urgency. "The article will put pressure on them. Clients will take notice. This is exactly the kind of leverage we need." He was right. Within hours, news spread that David Chen, one of Carter Events' biggest clients, had terminated his contract. A cascade followed. Vendors hesitating, smaller clients postponing, whispers about financial instability swirling in the local business community. I pictured my mother's office, once a place of tight control and rigid confidence, now filled with the sharp ring of phones and the frantic shuffling of paperwork. I imagined her standing at her desk, snapping orders at assistants, her voice clipped but her eyes betraying cracks. That evening, as I walked home past a newsstand, I caught sight of the company's name splashed across the local paper. 2 teenagers stood nearby, pointing and laughing at the headline. I felt a sting, not because they were laughing, but because it was proof. The Carter name, once untouchable, was now a punchline. From the outside, it looked like vindication, but inside me the emotions tangled. There was bitterness. Yes, the deep satisfaction of seeing justice begin to take shape. But there was also grief. That name was still mine, even if they tried to strip it away. Their downfall wasn't just theirs. It was tied to me, too. I didn't have to imagine long what it looked like inside the company walls. A former coworker of Daniel's, someone I'd met at a client dinner years ago, sent me a message on Facebook. "You wouldn't believe it, Emily. Your mom's holding meetings twice a day trying to calm everyone down. Half the staff is terrified. Daniel's snapping at people. It's chaos." The next day, I walked past their office building on my way to meet Robert. Through the glass, I saw a cluster of employees gathered in the lobby, their faces tight with worry. Margaret stood among them. Her voice animated, her hands slicing the air as she spoke. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the way her jaw clenched, the way her eyes darted around the room, not with confidence, but with panic she couldn't hide. She tried to look composed, to radiate authority, but even from the sidewalk I could see it. The tremor in her hands when she adjusted her papers, the way her smile faltered when a phone rang behind her. She was fighting to hold a collapsing empire together with nothing but a brittle facade. I stopped for a moment, watching from the street unnoticed in the crowd of passers-by. For years I had only seen her as unshakable, unmovable, convinced she was always right. Now for the first time I saw her falter. It wasn't triumph I felt. Not entirely. It was a strange mix of sorrow and grim satisfaction. As I turned away, the December wind whipping down the street, I realized something important. The cracks were already there before I ever pushed back. My mother and Daniel thought they could bury me, but they had been burying themselves all along. Now the world was just beginning to notice. I tightened my coat and walked on Florence's letter tucked safely in my bag, the words inside echoing louder than ever. Their empire was crumbling, and I didn't have to lift a finger to make it happen. The next meeting felt more like a courtroom than a conference room. Robert arranged the documents neatly in front of him, his calm demeanor masking the weight of what he was about to reveal. I sat across from my parents and Daniel again. Florence's letter folded in my lap, its presence grounding me. The air was thick, heavy with the silence of people bracing for impact. Robert began without preamble. In addition to the $150,000 improperly withdrawn from the trust, there is another matter. A withdrawal of $2,000 was made from a joint account belonging to Emily and Daniel. Records confirm Daniel initiated the transfer. My eyes flicked to my brother. Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk faltering for the first time. "It was an emergency," he muttered. "An emergency," I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. "You emptied the only account I had left while I was sleeping in a motel. That wasn't survival, Daniel. That was theft." Margaret's face flushed. "Enough, Emily." "Oh. This family has sacrificed everything to keep Carter events alive. You should be ashamed to drag us through this mud." My chest tightened, but anger steadied me. "Ashamed? You locked me out of the house on Christmas night. You stole the money Grandma left to protect me. You left me with nothing. And you want me to be ashamed?" Thomas shifted in his seat, his eyes downcast. Robert slid one of the documents toward him. "Mr. Carter, your signature appears on the withdrawal authorization for the trust funds. Do you acknowledge that my father's hand hovered above the paper but never touched it?" His jaw worked, his lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, he nodded once barely perceptible, his eyes never lifting from the table. The sight of it hit harder than I expected. My father had always been quiet, but part of me had clung to the hope that his silence meant he disagreed, that somewhere inside he was on my side. Seeing his signature on that page destroyed that hope. Margaret slammed her hand on the table, startling everyone. "This is madness. We are your family. We gave you everything. And this is how you repay us, by siding with outsiders against your own blood." I leaned forward, my hands trembling, but my voice clear. "You want to talk about betrayal, Mom? You betrayed me the moment you chose money over me. You betrayed Florence's wishes, and you betrayed your own daughter." "That's on you, not me." The room went silent. Even Daniel's bravado cracked, his eyes darting between us. Robert folded his hands calmly. "This isn't about family loyalty. This is about legal responsibility. The trust was clear. The misuse of funds cannot be ignored." The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Margaret's breathing grew harsh, her shoulders tense as she glared at me with a mixture of rage and something else. Fear. Thomas's gaze stayed fixed on the table, his hands clenched together. Daniel shifted in his chair, his earlier confidence drained, leaving only a restless anger simmering beneath the surface. For the first time, I realized there was no going back. The line had been crossed long ago, but here in this room it became undeniable. Whatever family we had once been had shattered. The bond was gone, replaced by signatures on fraudulent withdrawals and accusations that cut deeper than any blade. I looked down at Florence's letter, tracing the curve of her handwriting with my thumb. Her voice echoed in my mind, steady and sure. "If they choose money over you, remember that money belongs to you." When I lifted my head again, the weight in the room had shifted. They no longer looked like parents and a brother. They looked like adversaries. And I knew in that moment that the Carter family as I had known it was gone forever. Robert's voice carried both finality and reassurance when he told me, "The apartment deed is officially in your name, Emily." The remainder of the trust will also be transferred into an account accessible only to you. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled without feeling like the world would collapse around me. The apartment was a modest one-bedroom on the east side of Portland, tucked above a bakery that filled the air with the scent of fresh bread each morning. When I opened the door for the first time, the place was empty except for bare walls, a small kitchen, and sunlight spilling through the window onto hardwood floors. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. I carried my boxes up the narrow stairs one at a time, books in one, clothes in another, and my typewriter carefully wrapped in a blanket. My arms ached, sweat beading along my forehead despite the chill outside, but the effort felt different this time. Every step was a reminder that I wasn't dragging myself back into someone else's house. I was moving forward into my own. After unloading the last box, I stood in the middle of the room, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint chatter from the bakery downstairs. It was quiet otherwise, and for once the quiet didn't feel suffocating. It felt like freedom. I sat up slowly, deliberately. The thrift store desk I'd bought with the last bit of cash I dared to spend went against the window so I could watch the city lights while I worked. I placed a small plant, one of the few luxuries I'd allowed myself, on the sill. Then carefully, I unfolded Florence's letter and set it in a frame I'd picked up at a second-hand shop. I placed it at the center of the desk, her words watching over me like a compass pointing north. When the last item was unpacked, I plugged in my laptop. The screen glowed against the dim room, illuminating the bare walls. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For days, maybe weeks, I had been carrying words inside me with no place to put them. Now, in this tiny apartment that smelled faintly of yeast and hope, they finally had somewhere to land. The first sentence appeared shaky but real. On Christmas night, they chose money over me. I stared at it for a long time, my chest rising and falling with something that felt like both grief and release. I kept typing, not a full script, yet just fragments. Images of snow voices raised around a dinner table, the sound of a door slamming. My tears blurred the screen, but I didn't stop. Each word felt like a thread stitching me back together. When the exhaustion hit, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The heater rattled softly, and outside a car horn honked. Normal life carried on indifferent to my battles, but that indifference gave me comfort. For the first time, I wasn't being watched, judged, or measured. I was simply me in my own space. Later that night, I curled up on the futon I'd dragged from the corner, the scent of fresh paint still lingering faintly in the air. The apartment was sparse, the mattress thin, but it felt more like home than the Carter house ever had. I reached over and touched the framed letter on the desk, whispering, "Thank you, Grandma. I'll make this count." Sleep came easier than it had in months, and as I drifted off, the words from my screen echoed in my mind. On Christmas night, they chose money over me. It was no longer just a memory. It was the beginning of a story I would tell on my own terms. The first time I walked back into the Portland Film Collective, my palms were damp with nerves. The space was alive with energy. Posters of indie films plastered the walls. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, and clusters of people huddled in corners swapping ideas. I kept my head down, clutching my notebook, terrified I'd be exposed as an imposter. The workshop leader, a tall woman with sharp glasses, introduced me to two other attendees. "Emily, this is Levi Brooks and Tara Lopez. You three might have a lot in common." Levi was a young director, lanky, with restless hands that seemed to sketch frames in the air as he spoke. Tara, a producer with quick eyes and an easy smile, carried herself with a confidence I envied instantly. They both shook my hand warmly. No hesitation, no smirk like Daniel's, no judgment like Margaret's. Later that week, I worked up the courage to share a script I'd been drafting since moving into the apartment. It was raw, drawn straight from the wounds of the past few months. Levi flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. Tara leaned over his shoulder, scanning quickly. When they finished, Levi looked up first. "It's rough," he admitted, "but it's real. There's something here that cuts deep." Tara nodded, her voice softer but no less firm. "You're writing from a place of truth. People feel that. Don't lose it." I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until it escaped in a shaky laugh. For years, my words had been dismissed as nonsense. Now, for the first time, someone outside of Florence believed in them. It wasn't long before the three of us decided to work together on a short film. The story was thinly veiled, a fictional version of my own Christmas night. The cold dismissal, the betrayal, the fragile rebuilding afterward. I hesitated at first, afraid it was too personal, but Levi insisted, "That's what makes it powerful." Pre-production was a blur of meetings in coffee shops, scribbled shot lists on napkins, and Tara negotiating with local vendors to secure equipment on a shoestring budget. I offered my apartment as our headquarters, its bare walls soon covered with sticky notes and storyboard sketches. For the first time, the space felt alive. The day of our first shoot arrived cold and gray. We set up by the Willamette River, the water choppy under a winter sky. Levi barked instructions with the excitement of someone seeing his vision take shape, while Tara kept the crew moving smoothly despite the biting wind. I stood back watching as the actress we'd cast, someone with kind eyes and a fragile strength, delivered lines I had written at my desk only weeks earlier. On Christmas night, she said, her voice trembling, "They chose money over me." The words hit me like a wave. I had thought I was ready to see them performed, but hearing them aloud against the backdrop of the river shattered something inside me. My knees buckled slightly, and I pressed a hand to my mouth. Levi glanced over concerned, but I shook my head. Tears blurred my vision, spilling down my cheeks before I could stop them. They weren't the bitter tears I'd cried alone in a motel bed. These were different. Hot, cleansing, heavy with release. Watching that moment unfold on camera felt like stitching up a wound I had carried too long. It wasn't erasing the pain, but transforming it, turning my suffering into something that might speak to others. Tara slipped an arm around my shoulder, her voice gentle. "This is why you write, Emily. To turn the worst nights into something that can light the way for someone else." I nodded, unable to answer, my throat too tight. The river flowed steady beside us, the camera rolled on, and I let myself cry, not from despair this time, but from the fragile, undeniable feeling that maybe, just maybe, I was healing. A month later, I sat in the back row of a small theater downtown, my heart racing as the lights dimmed. The Portland Indie Film Festival wasn't Sundance, but for me, it felt just as monumental. On the screen in front of us, my story unfolded. Actors breathing life into words I had once typed in the solitude of my apartment. The familiar sting of betrayal, the icy chill of that Christmas night, the fragile hope of starting over. All of it flickered across the screen. At first I couldn't watch. I kept my eyes on the floor, terrified the audience would laugh, that they'd see my pain as melodrama. But then a hush fell over the room, heavy and reverent. People leaned forward in their seats. Someone sniffled quietly. And when the credits rolled, when my name appeared under, "Written by Emily Carter," the applause came. Not polite clapping, but a swell of sound that seemed to lift me out of my seat. My throat closed up, tears burning as I realized those were my words they were clapping for. My story. My voice. Levi and Tara hugged me in the lobby afterward, their excitement bubbling over. "Did you hear them?" Tara beamed. "They loved it." Levi grinned, shaking his head. "I told you, Emily. Raw truth always lands." Later that evening, I went home to my apartment above the bakery. I kicked off my shoes, curled into the couch, and turned on the television. The news was covering a different story. Carter events, facing legal penalties, fines for misuse of funds, and the steady loss of clients who no longer trusted their name. A reporter's voice read off the damage. Contracts dissolved, lawsuits, pending, reputation crumbling. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just sat quietly, the flicker of the screen lighting my small living room. For so long, their downfall had been all I dreamed of. Now that it was real, all I felt was distance, like I was watching strangers destroy themselves. On the coffee table, Florence's letter lay beneath the glass frame, her handwriting still steady, her words still true. I traced a fingertip along the glass and whispered softly, "You were right, Grandma. They chose money over me, but I chose something better." I looked around my little apartment. The thrift store desk, the potted plant stretching toward the window, the stack of notebooks filled with new ideas. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Every piece of it was proof that I could build a life without begging for their approval. That Christmas night would never leave me. The image of my mother pointing to the door. Daniel's smirk, my father's silence. They would always be scars. But they weren't the end of my story. They were only the beginning. As I sat there, the heater humming softly, the smell of fresh bread wafting up from the bakery below, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. No more running after their acceptance. No more waiting for them to see me. I was enough. My voiceover closes the circle in my mind, the words, clear and final. On Christmas night, they chose $150,000 instead of me. But I chose freedom. And that was the greatest gift of all. If you've ever felt that same sting of betrayal, if you've ever been cast aside by the people who were supposed to protect, you know this. You're not alone. Share your story with me. Let's build a place where voices like ours can be heard, where scars can become strength, because sometimes the only way to heal is to tell it out loud.